Welcome to the video 4.1 on the Blender 3.0 course. Again, this is what you see when you start Blender the first time, but let's talk about the object origin. When you zoom into this view, you can see that somewhere in the center of the universe and also in the center of this object you have an orange point that doesn't move no matter what you do. Well, that is the object origin for this object, and Blender considers every object to be located where the origin is, no matter what the object looks like. So in a cube you have it there in the center, but if you add a Suzanne by adding a monkey, it is not really in the center of the monkey. Well, actually it's hard to say where the monkey is centered, but somewhere it also has an object origin. Now you have a couple of ways of moving the object origin. The first origin moving system is by going into edit mode and then moving your object on the y-axis, for example. Now your object origin is no longer where it used to be, not inside the object anymore. Consequently, what happens now is that if you go into your side view, you can see that it rotates around that point now. Rotate on the y-axis, your object rotates around the origin and not around the center of the cube anymore. To get your cube to have the origin inside of it again, the easiest way to do that is to say object set origin. You have different options here. For example, you can set geometry to origin, which will move your origin to your geometry to the origin point, or you can say origin to geometry, in which case the origin point will jump to the center of the cube. You can also say origin to 3D cursor, which is very useful if you have a specific place where you want the object origin to be. Or you can say origin to center of mass of the cube by surface, or the origin to the center of mass by volume. These are different in objects such as the Suzanne, which is not a rectangle or a cube or a sphere. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will now just select geometry to origin. This will snap the cube back to where it was, and if I say origin to geometry, it will happen the other way around. The origin is now inside your cube again. And if I do it one more time, we can say set origin to 3D cursor. So if I place my 3D cursor up here and say object set origin to 3D cursor, like so, then select the object and say object set origin to 3D cursor. The cursor is now up here, and rotating the object will rotate it around that specific point in space. All of these techniques have their place in the world, and as a general rule it can be said that you want to keep your origin inside your object. So I'll just go back to object set origin to geometry, and now it's inside my object again, and I can trust that it will rotate around that thing there. Another thing we have in here that is related to this topic is the rotating point or pivot point, which is different from the origin and it's different from the 3D cursor. It is the point around which your world will rotate. Usually you have it at individual origins. That will mean that your objects will rotate on the origin. I'll return that. I'll add another object so that you can see what I mean. Again, a monkey. Now if I have them both selected and the pivot point is set at individual origins, saying R on the X direction, which means that they will both rotate around the X axis on their own origins. This is the big thing. They are rotating on their own origins. If this is set to 3D cursor and I say rotate, they will rotate around wherever the 3D cursor is. I can also set this to be bounding box center, and now they will rotate around an imaginary box that is the smallest box inside which both of these objects would fit. There's also a median point, which is the median point between the two origins of the objects. And there's the active element, which means they will rotate around the origin of the active element. So you need to understand that there are 5 different ways that you can actually rotate objects. So let me take another file just to make it easier for everybody. Don't save this. And go back to my item menu. This here is the view widget, and this one enables you to quickly see your view from the front view, or from the side view, or from the top view. Of course, you can just press down on your mouse, on the scroll wheel of your mouse, and go back to this perspective view, which is easy enough to see. Or you can see from the bottom or the other side. This is actually from the bottom, top, and you can play with this widget here so that you can see your object the way you want to see it. Sometimes you need to see what you are going to do with your object. So if you click on this tool shelf here on the left hand side, you can see that you have the move button here, you have the rotate button here, and you have the scale button here, and the ends of these sticks, whatever they are, changes. So this would be moving with the arrows, this would be rotating with the spheres, and then this would be scaling with the boxes at the ends of these tools. Now, sometimes you may want to actually see all of this at once. In that case, you can go over here to your overlays, and in your overlays, you can turn on your gizmos. So this would be your overlays menu, and you can turn on the move and rotate and scale. You can have all of them on at the same time if you wish. Now, personally, I've never used this, but I know that there are people who do that, to move, to scale, and to rotate. You can have all of these in the same place, if that somehow is what you want to do. But those are found here in the overlays menu. I usually don't have them on. The circle in the gizmo is actually rather too powerful in my mind if you are using it here in the user perspective view, because you have absolutely no control what is actually happening to your object. So I would say that you don't use the center gizmo until you have selected one of the views along the axis, in the right orthographics, for example, because now that you move it, you know that it will not move in the x-axis, it will just move along the z-axis and the y-axis. And if you click on the y-axis, you can make the same thing. You can only move it along the x-axis and up and down the z-axis, but it won't move in the y-axis. Because if you do it like this and you grab this, you can see how all the three over here, how all your three location measurements are changing, and doing this is not going to be a good idea. As a good rule of thumb, I would say that you need to learn a couple of quick keys for doing stuff. First of all, there are the G for grab or move. So when you press G, you can move your object like this just by moving the mouse. When you say GX, you get to move it on the X-axis. GY, you can move it on the Y-axis. And of course GZ, you can move it only in the Z-axis. You can also say G and Shift Z, and this will mean that your object will only move in the X and the Y direction, but you cannot move it up and down. You can see how the Z value in the N properties toolbar doesn't change. And the same applies for rotation. You can rotate freely along all, but you can see how this actually turns along all three axes, and you have no way of knowing what you actually wind up with. So whenever I hit R to rotate, always hit the axis, just to be on the safe side. Rotate Y, rotate Z, rotate everything but Z, and rotate everything but X. So Shift Z means do X and Y but not Z. I'll just set it back to rotation to 0, 0, 0. So we're back to where we started. And the same applies to scale. Scale on the X direction, scale on the Y direction, scale on the Z direction. Scale on anything but the Z direction. So those are the quick keys that you absolutely need to learn. Now in Blender you select stuff with the left menu, left mouse button, and you can get the context menu by right clicking. And this will always have the proper selection for whatever you want to do, which is very quick, very handy. But if there's stuff that you know you can do, but you cannot remember what the name was or how to get it, so you can always set your preferences here in the preferences menu and key map and make the spacebar action search. This way, when you click on your spacebar, you can search, for example, for the quad view. You can see that it's Control Alt Q. So now if I have it looking like this and I want to go back, I can say Control Alt Q and I'm back into my single view. Here on the top left hand corner you have the modes. You have your object mode for moving the entire object, your edit mode for moving single vertices, your sculpt mode, single or multiple vertices actually, your sculpt mode for doing sculpt work, vertex paint for painting vertices, or actually vertex sets, weight paint for painting stuff like if you have a cloth, you have a cloth modifier on, and you want to make somebody wear a thing, you can actually use weight painting to make your cloth bend like real cloth. Of course, this is not part of the basic course, but when you're doing this on your own, you may want to have a look at that. And texture paint is what you can do when you want to paint directly on your object. Okay, what else? So let's go back to editing a mesh. I'll give us a cube, and I will just use these edge loops to give us a little more vertices into it. One more here, so that we can do this. Now, if you are using the edge selection tool and you want to delete some edges, you can click one edge and say delete, and it will lose those edges only. You can also say X and only faces. That will only edges and faces. And if you select a couple of faces, like so, and you say X only faces, you will be left with the edges intact. This is sometimes useful when you know that you may have to reattach a face in here. To get a face back, you would have to select the two corresponding faces and hit edges and hit the F key so that you have it build back. So to select multiple faces, you can just shift click and get more of them selected, and then X and only faces, which will leave you with those faces that you did not select. This can sometimes be useful. If I extrude this a little, and I then will scale, not on the Z axis, Shift Z, I can turn it into something looking like this. Or I can rotate on the Z axis, or I can rotate on the X axis to make it look like that. Again, this is more like a modern sculpture than anything else. But when you have selected something, you can always apply the same methods to anything that you have selected. So if instead just a single vertex, you cannot do much more than just extrude. But when you have an edge or you have a face, you can do all the scaling, rotation, transforming, whatever you need to do. And the delete of anything will then give you this list. And if you say here vertices, you are left with what is outside of your selection. Also this, by the way, if you want to delete everything but these parts here, you can select the part you want to keep, then press Ctrl I, which will it will invert your selection. So if you have the selection done that you want to keep, hit Ctrl I and it will be inverted. And now if you say delete edges, well, that wasn't very clever. That's because this is, I'll have to add another one of those here. Now I select the parts that I want to keep, this, and this, Control I and delete vertices. I am left with nothing but the parts that I am wanting to keep. Again, this may or may not be useful for you, but sometimes you need to do something like this. So the X menu is your best friend. So let me go here and select one of these edge loops by alt clicking on the edge loop. If I don't need that anymore, I can say dissolve edge loops, dissolve edges, and this will take out that area there, or the edges. Also I can say this will do nothing because I have no faces selected. Edge loops will lose the edge loop and then select whatever the edge loop was touching at the time that I deleted it. So the X menu, the delete menu, acts on whatever you have selected at any given moment. Collapse is a slightly different thing. Collapse edges and faces will do this. It will take whatever was selected and collapse that into a single vertex. So that's what happens here. If you want to select a bunch of faces that are connected, you can press down the Alt key and it will select around the object as far as it can go. And if you want to have another bunch of faces selected like this, you can Alt and Shift, and you can get it added to your selection. So the third Shift and Alt selection would give you this. So the Alt, also when you have the, if you don't have anything selected here, you can Alt and click on the edge loop, and it will select everything in that edge loop. And then you can scale on the y-axis, for example, on the x-axis, for example, or on scale on the everything but the y-axis will do you this. Okay, let's discuss a different type of object, which would be a sphere, and this time it would be a UV sphere. If you come here and you alt-click on any point on an edge between two vertices like so, alt-click will give you a selection along that line. So if you now say X and vertices, this is what happens. You will lose the poles of the sphere because they were selected. So if you don't want this to happen, you can just shift click on the poles. Now this will deselect only those two. And now if you say X and vertices, you still have the top of your sphere, but you're missing a slice from it. If you are using face selection mode and alt click on this, and you can then say faces, it will limit it here because this is a different face. It's a triangular face. That's why it ends in here. But if you go the other way around and you delete those, it goes all the way through the sphere, as you can see. Sometimes you need to select with a border. That is easily reached here. When you click and hold on this, you can select the box. You can get these faces selected that your mouse touches when you drag. This is actually good, very useful. But if you want to, and you can also use the circle tool, which is a C key, and with the scrolling mouse you can make your selection tool as big as you want. With the C key and make it small and click here, and you only get to select these faces here. And shift and click will give you another one. Actually, you don't even need a shift when you are in the circle selection mode. And the right click will end the circle selection mode. What else? There's always so much to tell you. So let's add another cube and apply a subdivision surface to it. Sorry, not a subdivision surface, but to subdivide this as many times as we need. Subdivide. Okay, so we have a lot of vertices now. Because I need to tell you about proportional editing. Proportional editing happens here when you have a lot of stuff that you need to select. But let's say that you use the circle tool to select a bunch of vertices up here. Circle, like so. Now, if you were to pull these up by pressing the G key on the Z axis, it will do this for you, which may or may not be useful. but you can turn on proportional editing here, and you have a bunch of these different types of ways it's going to pull when you now go down there and pull. So if I say smooth, it will pull everything that is connected to it, but in a smooth way. And if I disconnect the connected only, it does basically the same thing, but you get a control tool for this. So you can, with the scroll wheel, you can define how much the pull will affect. There's also a sphere. So if I now select a bunch of vertices here and grab them, it is more like a sphere. And again, you have the scroll mouse to do this. There is sharp. Which looks like this. Again, you see that I didn't use the Z axis, and that's why it's actually pulling into two directions. So that's why it would always be a good idea to say GZ and then use this to come up with the, well, you could use this to make a mountain line, for example. So this is how you use this one. The others are just different types of pull for this proportional pull. Okay, the last thing I want to show in this video is the snapping tools. So let's say that we have a cube and we have a sphere, a UV sphere that goes in here, and we want to snap these together. For example, I want to snap this object here on top of this cube. The snap tools are here. This is the magnet, and you have different ways of snapping things. You can snap the object that you want to snap on any vertex or any edge or any face or any volume or the edge center, or I'm not quite sure what the edge perpendicular means, but the vertex, edge and face are by far the most important ones. So if you turn on move and increment and let's say increment, and you can then move this thing, it will move by snapping to the next vertex in the grid. As you can see, it moves in a jumpy way. You can snap to the closest vertex or the center or the median or the active vertex. So then you can snap to an edge, you can snap to any face, and you can snap objects together by using moving the object origin as I showed you before. Let's say that you have this cube here. You want to snap it to the world origin first. And I want this ball to snap on top of this cube. To do that, I need to take this ball, the sphere actually, and locate the single vertex here at the very bottom of it. Select the single vertex, say Shift S and snap cursor to selected. Now you have the 3D cursor on that single vertex there. Go out of edit mode with the tab key, say object set origin the 3D cursor. Now this ball has the origin at the very bottom. You go here into your cube and you snap the cursor to the top face of this object. Snap cursor to selected. Now we don't need it here anymore. The cursor can now be placed here because we already have moved the origin of this object here. So I go out of object edit mode into object mode, select this object here, and then tell it to go where the 3D cursor is. So Shift S for the snap tool, selection to cursor. And now the ball or the sphere is exactly on top of the cube. If I want to make it go here into the corner of the cube, I can select this one single vertex, snap cursor to that, cursor to selected, go out of edit mode and in object mode, set origin to 3D cursor, select the ball, snap, selection to cursor, and now the ball is here. The snapping tools are actually very useful, not only the Shift S that I showed you, but it's actually very useful when you are placing objects on top of each other, especially if you have if you have tilted faces that you want to snap to, so that the object gets the same tilt as the as the object that you are snapping to. But there are videos for that online, which you can watch. All you have to do is to search for Blender snapping tools, and they will give you detailed videos on how to do extended snapping. Just one more word about the normals of any object. This is the sphere, and you may want to see the normals, which are small lines that point perpendicularly away from the surface of each of the faces. To do that, all you need to do is to turn on your normals overlay, which you can see when you go into your overlays, which are here, and turn on your normals. This would be your vertex normals, your edge normals, and your face normals. So when you turn on your face normals, you can see the direction of each of the faces, which way they are facing. Because if you were to extrude along a normal, select one of these faces and go into the extrusion, and in here select extrude along normals, it will come up along the normal that you can see. So while normals are not something that you are using constantly, sometimes what can happen is that you, let's say that you scale something so that you pass 0, you go into the minus scales, which means the object will be turned inside out. The normals will then be pointing inwards. So in here, in this particular example, all of these small turquoise lines would be pointing inside of the ball, which is not what you usually want. But in that case, you can go mesh, and you can go normals and recalculate outside, and this will recalculate your mesh normals so that they point out again. Again, this is not something that happens every day, but if that happens, then you know how to fix it. Well, that will conclude this particular video. Let's see you again in a different one.